welcome back to Old Testament. This module will be covering the book of Numbers, the fourth book in the Pentateuch or the Torah, which we'll talk a little bit about today. Today we are going to focus on outlines. How do you outline a text? What is an outline? How does it work? And why do we care so much about outlining? You've probably noticed that in previous videos we've talked about how to outline texts, meaning how do you cut up the text into different parts and organize them into some sort of scheme and label the different parts of it. It's a bit like if you were to make an instruction booklet for something like a computer and you're going to label all the parts of the computer. It's labeling all the parts of the text and describing them by their function. Just like for a instruction booklet for a computer, you'd say this key does this and this key does that and this plug does this. We're asking the question, what do these different parts of the text do? And how do we label them? How do we divide them up? And how do we organize them? And it's my argument that there's not just one way to do this for all texts. Instead, there's limitless ways we can do this, some of them probably more helpful than others. But today I'm going to show you 3 different ways to divide up the book of Numbers. Now, the book of Numbers is very few people's favorite book. It is confusing, it's strange, there's a lot of God's anger and wrath in the book. There's a lot of stories that are unsettling, a bit unusual, and there's a lot of just what American Christians especially think are just really boring parts. There's genealogies, there's the actual census that's carried out, there's long bits of law and instruction, and it just seems kind of boring and strange to most people. But my argument is that if we take a close look at the way that this text is organized, as jumbled as it seems to be, if we try to find some logic in the way that this text is organized, what we'll do is we'll find a sense of meaning. So when we divide up the text into these parts, when we outline a text, we are making some kind of argument about its meaning, whether we know it or not. And sometimes we divide up the text first, and then we can figure out what we think it's trying to say. So today I'm going to show you 3 different ways that I think are all good. They're all defensible. They all work. 3 different ways of dividing up the text of the book of Numbers. Now, maybe you think there's only one meaning to the book of Numbers, and there's only ever been one meaning to it. Well, then why would we preach the text? Why would we preach the same biblical story more than once? Wouldn't you just repeat the same sermon over and over again to explain what the text means? No, instead, we preach the text differently every time we listen for God's voice, how it's working in the world, how it's working in the text, how it's working in our communities, and God might be saying something a bit different through these texts. So I'm going to show you how there's at least three different ways to even understand how the book of Numbers is put together. And they have 3 different ways to help us understand who God is and who we are and what we're supposed to do in the world. So that's our task for today, is to think about outlines, organization, categorization, labeling, and the book of Numbers. There's actually 3 different ways to talk about this book, and those 3 different ways of talking about the book are connected to my 3 different organizations and 3 different meanings of the book. One way you can talk about the book of Numbers is say it's the 4th book of the Torah. The Torah meaning the first 5 books of the Old Testament or of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So Numbers is the 4th out of those 5 books of the Torah. We'll talk a little bit about what Torah means, but if we think about it in terms of the Torah, that's the organizing principle for it. That will help us to understand this book in one particular way. Another traditional name for the book of Numbers is Bamidbar. You can see this Hebrew word here. If you're in Hebrew, the ba part, that's the inseparable preposition, right? The ba, which means in or at the time of. So here we go, in, and then midbar, which means wilderness, in the wilderness, Bamidbar. So in the wilderness. And then this is the traditional Jewish way, Bamidbar, of describing the book of Numbers. It begins with that phrase, Bamidbar, in the wilderness. So typically in the Pentateuch and then in some other books of the Old Testament, the first word of the book actually kind of describes the book. It was used in the ancient world as really like a title. They didn't really have titles for most books. They just knew the first few words of that text and then used that as a stand-in for a title. So the book of Genesis is known in the Jewish tradition as Bereshit, which just means in the beginning. That's the first word of the book of Genesis. Shemot is Exodus because it starts with these, like the names of, is just the way that Exodus begins the story. That's the first kind of a full Hebrew word in that book. So these are traditional ways of naming the text. You can actually see this too with like papal encyclicals, like when the Pope puts out a new basically papal paper. It's always known as the first few words in Latin of that text. So this is that ancient practice of how to name texts. If we think about the text of the book of Numbers in terms of Bamidbar, its Jewish naming, that helps us to think about kind of motion and geographical location. So if you foreground geographical location, which is a major part of this book, where are they? They're moving around the whole time. That will lead us to a different way of thinking about organizing the text and will lead us to a different meaning, I think. And then third, there's arithmoi. This is the Greek word arithmoi, like arithmetic comes from this, right? Like numbering or counting. So this is numbers, and this is where the English name Numbers for the book comes from. And the Greek tradition, the Greek-speaking Jewish and then Christian traditions, tended to name these books more by like what they were about, the content. And the book of Numbers does include two different numberings or censuses of the changing composition of the people in the wilderness. Changing composition because the old generation dies and there's a new generation that comes about. Those are those two major events. So if we organize the book like that, about the censuses that organize the generations of these wandering peoples, then we're going to have a different meaning and a different organization for the book too. So law, movement and geography, numbering and generations. 3 different ways to think about this book and 3 different meanings that come from it. So we'll have 3 different videos, one for each of these different ways of organizing this material. So the first way of talking about the book of Numbers, that is by Torah, the 4th book of the law or of the Torah. The first thing we should probably say is that Torah comes from the Hebrew word yara. Torah is a noun. The verb yara, from which this derives, the root yara, means to point at something. So this is a word used for instruction or teaching. It's really important here that it's not law. Like there are good Hebrew words for law that we would use in English, like legal precedents or legal rules, things that involve judges in courtrooms. The words like chok, like statute in Hebrew, would be closer to this kind of world of law. And those are used to describe stuff in, especially the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy. They have laws in them. But they're not just laws, and Torah doesn't primarily describe law. What Torah describes is God's instruction or God's teaching, which I do think changes the way that we think about this, especially as Christians talking about Jews and the law, which tends to go off in crazy directions. We get off the rails pretty quickly as Christians talking about this, because Jews don't understand that the law saves them. They understand that God saves them. God saved them and continues to save them. Out of sheer grace. God chose the people of the Hebrews for no reason of their own, but because God loved them. So God's choice and God's grace comes first, and then comes the instruction, which is what God gives us to know how to be good in the world, but also how to become this kind of priestly people that God describes in Exodus 19 that's going to bring blessing to all the nations of the earth, as described in Genesis 12. This is part of God's mission, right? So God's going to instruct us and help us to become better, to grow, to learn and shift and change. So if we think about Torah that way, instead of thinking about it as this deadweight law that's supposed to like condemn us and is playing kind of the role of the accuser or something in God's scheme, we're probably going to get a lot more out of the Old Testament as a whole, but particularly out of the Torah itself. So one thing that's really important here is if we try to divide up the book of Numbers into where it has its Torah or instruction or legal stuff. It's really interesting. This book has tons of just chapters that have to do with rules and regulations, but also with just stuff that God's trying to teach the people, right? You ran into those, and it was kind of like running into a brick wall probably, because we, as modern readers, we prefer narratives. We like the stories, right? But this stuff that's like chapters and chapters about who the Kohathites are, that's going to be probably a little less interesting to us. But if we think about it and divide it up into its different groups of instructions and then narratives that go along with it, we find an interesting pattern that emerges. So chapters 1 through 10, we can say, are all Torah or instruction. Some of these are laws. A lot of them are just kind of things that God is telling you about. God's teaching about different kind of groups of Hebrew people, including these different subdivisions of the Levites and the sons of Aaron being set apart. I hope you noticed in chapter 3, there's some really interesting stuff about how the Levites serve Aaron Aaron, and they cannot sacrifice at the altar and so on. The Levites are the substitutes for the firstborn. So they are in a way like a substitute from. They are a gift to God from among the people of Israel. This is complicated. We'll get to the book of Deuteronomy and we'll see that the Levites were often treated poorly because of this. And the book of Deuteronomy has compassion on them, or maybe comes from them, and demands equal rights to the Levites from among Deuteronomy. Remember Korah and Korah's rebellion. So this is a live issue in this text. So in any event, just to say that's a major part of this earlier bit of instruction. There's also a censusing, right? Counting of the people. You'll also find within chapters 1 through 10 that really interesting prayer, the priestly prayer in Numbers 6, verses 24 through 26. That comes right after the 22. I'm sorry, through 26. This, but it comes right after the Nazirite vow, which is interesting, and we'll get back to later when we talk about Samson. But all to say that this is the oldest biblical text we have, as I mentioned in our class on P and the priestly source. So here it is, this silver amulet from Ketef Chinom, this area just outside Jerusalem that seems to belong to a priest. And this was that priest's amulet. This is the oldest bit of biblical text we have. But anyway, that's within this bit of text here. But then we break into this narrative. In chapter 10 to chapter 14, we get all these stories that deal a little bit with some of the instructions that we found in chapters 1 through 10, but also that are addressed in chapter 15, which goes back into this world of instruction or law. Then we go back into the narratives, and then we come back into this period of instruction, back into narratives, back into instruction, back into narratives, back to instruction. So it goes back and forth, and it ends with the book of Numbers ends with this sustained bunch of narratives at the end of the text. There's 3 long chapters there, or 2.5 chapters of narrative there at the end. So what we can say here is that the book begins and ends with instruction that bounds these narratives. So to me, when I look at this, I say, okay, so we're going back and forth. We're ping-ponging back and forth between narrative and instruction. And why in the world would we have this, right? We might have this. I mean, God is kind of setting up these instructions for the people, right? They've just left Egypt. They need to do things differently. They need to be coached in how to live a different life than the life that they have lived their entire life under oppression under Pharaoh. It would be pretty easy for them to want to just build a new system where they're Pharaoh, right? And all the peoples around them are being subjugated in the same way. That would be understandable. How else are they supposed to know how to live other than how they've lived their entire lives, right? So God is trying to kind of give them a different way to live, it would seem. So we'll talk a little bit more about the particularities of the law when we talk about Deuteronomy as well. But there are some struggles over this vision, right? How do we live this out? And so we can see in the Korah story, there is a major dispute about how do we live out our organization as a people. How do we think about privilege? How do we think about access to the presence of God in the temple? How do we think about who's in charge and where we're supposed to go and what we're supposed to do, right? So there's struggles over how the people are supposed to live out these principles of God's instruction. But to me, one of the most interesting parts of putting this all together like this, to say that there's this instruction that interweaves with narrative, is that on several occasions, the narrative and the instructions that come after it or right before it are intertwined, and they are actually responsive to one another. So paying close attention to how these particular stories and bits of narrative interact, we can see that there are these bits of dynamic law, that is, places where there's God's instruction in the text that is responding in some way to the human condition and to human problems. This is so important to me because we can see that the law is not static. God gives the law at Sinai, and then God is tinkering with the law all the way unto the land. The book of Numbers is a book about not stable law that never changes. God gave the law and it just always stuck around or something, because how could you ever change it? Because it was always perfect from the very beginning. That's one way of thinking about the law. But the book of Numbers undermines that the whole way. That's the entire point, it seems, if you organize the book this way. That is to say, God is always responding to these changing situations. And our law and our instructions, our ethical formations, our procedures, right, are the principles by which we live, the sort of rules that we make that organize our communities. We also need to be responsive in all those ways to changing situations, to the voices of certain people, which we'll see in the text, and also to God's willingness and being excited to change the law to fit changing times and to fit new conversations that have emerged among the people. This is, I think, an amazing and a strange thing to many Christians who just think, well, God says something and it never changes. But we also know that Jesus himself does a little game with this, right? You've heard it said, and I say to you. But Jesus also says that none of the law is going to go away, right? And he says this in the book of Matthew. So Jesus is both in the book of Matthew saying that none of the law is going to ever go away, and you heard it said by Moses, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a suggestion here. I'm going to update it a bit. We'll see that Jesus is not coming up with that himself. This is something that happens in the Torah itself. So let's start with Numbers chapter 9. So if you turn with me to Numbers chapter 9, you'll see this is in the middle of that first bit, which is mostly instruction, but there's these like little bits of what you might think of as narrative in the way. And so this is one of those bits where there's the narrative kind of stuck in with the instruction part. It's really interesting. So God and Moses are in the wilderness of Sinai. God is speaking to Moses here, and God starts to talk about the Passover, which we've already heard about in Exodus. But this will be the first Passover they've celebrated, outside of that, right? So how are you supposed to do this in the wilderness? Well, God gives some instructions, right? These instructions are about a particular day, right? And you're not supposed to do certain things in that day, like touch corpses, right? And get this kind of contagion, this ritual contagion, or ritual impurity that we talked about with the pea materials. If God's going to be present with the people in a particular way, it's going to have to be with certain conditions met, right? Certain procedures. So the problem is that there's certain people. This always happens in these texts. There's certain people who are left out because of these problems. So the problems that emerge from God's rules. So look at verse 5. So the people kept the Passover in the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight in the wilderness at Sinai, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, so the Israelites did. Now there were certain people who were unclean through touching a corpse, so that they could not keep Passover on that day. Now remember, these people aren't bad. They haven't disobeyed Moses or God. God doesn't want them to avoid touching all corpses. These might be their friends and neighbors that they are helping to bury, which is an important part of ancient Israelite tradition of taking care of the bodies of loved ones. We also can say maybe these were people whose job this was. There are people who work in this care for families, right? And they are people who dig and help create the space to hold the bodies. They're people who help with these kind of services that happen here. So somebody has to do this work. And are they supposed to pay a punishment for it by not getting to celebrate with everyone else on the most special day of the year just because they did what they were supposed to do? So the people are saying, right? They came before Moses and Aaron on that day at the end of verse 6 and then starting verse 7. So the people come to Moses and Aaron. It's really important here that the people are raising the voice, right? Moses and Aaron this is an oversight. It's not that they're trying to be mean, I don't think, but they just aren't thinking about this particular issue. They're looking past and looking over certain people's experiences. Those people raise their voices to the entire congregation, to Moses and Aaron, and they say, although we are unclean through touching a corpse, verse 7, why must we be kept from presenting the Lord's offering at its appointed time among the Israelites? They say it. They're not worried about, getting struck by lightning or something. And Moses does not say to them, it's because God made the law and you can't change the law because it's God's law. And why would you ever say this? It's bad to say this, right? You shouldn't ask questions about God's law. It's just the law. They don't say that. Moses instead says, wait here so that I may hear from the Lord what the Lord will command concerning you. Moses expects that God's going to have something to say about this because people are being left out. This goes contrary. This contradicts one of the main principles of ancient Israel's polity or organization, which is that all of the people are supposed to have access in some way to God, not all in the exact same way, but everyone is supposed to in some way have access to this festival. It's a festival for all the people, all Israel. I'll have more to say about this in the next module on Deuteronomy, where we talk about the law, but just about how revolutionary this is, that there is a law code that addresses all the people. So we'll get back to that later, but just know for now that this is a radical political idea in the ancient world, that all people are in some way protected by the law, and that the society is organized in order to not leave anyone out. This is a radical, strange idea in the ancient world. And here we see Moses not getting upset at the people who say we've been left out. Instead, Moses says, God's probably going to have something to say about this, so wait here and let's see what God says. So then the Lord spoke to Moses, and God does not say, I said at Sinai, I could never change it. The law is the law, or something like that, right? No. Instead, God says, speak to the Israelites. Verse 10, saying, any of you or your descendants who's unclean through touching a corpse or who's away on a journey shall still keep the Passover to the Lord. In the second month, in the 14th day, at twilight they shall keep it. They shall have their unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat noted to the morning, and so on. And then verse 14, any alien residing among you who wishes to keep the Passover to the Lord shall do so according to the statute of the Passover, according to its regulation. You shall have one statute for the resident alien and the native. That is to say, there is no division under the law. There's no segregation under the law. There's no second law for the alien or for the wanderer or for the person who isn't genetically related to ancient Israelites, or, every single person is protected the same way under this law. That's really important here. And wandering aliens have no protections under law codes in the ancient world, except in ancient Israel. So that's the one we can find. But the bigger point here too is that God makes new law to transform the law to make it possible for all people to celebrate the Passover. Important thing here being that God makes a second Passover, right? So God's not going to, there's always going to be somebody who's left out from the particular day of the Passover if you have these strict purity regulations. And some people are just away on a journey. Some people can't make it, right? So we're going to have a backup Passover. We're going to have a second Passover. And you can be more careful. So if you have to miss the first Passover, there's going to be a party for all the people who were left out the first time. And it's going to be just the same as the first party. It's not going to be any worse. There's going to be all the same stuff there. It's not, you can't gather all the people in the same way all the time, but this is what we're going to do. This is amazing. It's fascinating. I mean, people don't come to kings in the ancient world and say, you made a bad law, we're going to change it. The king would be very upset about that. You don't go to a god and say, you messed up, you made a wrong law, bad law, or something like here. That is, kings and gods who have sovereign authority in the ancient world were understood to have true sovereign authority, and challenging them was treason. But here we have a challenge that is then met with new law, changing law, dynamic law. Now we see this exact same thing happen in Numbers 27 and Numbers 36. If you turn with me to Numbers 27, one of my favorite chapters of the Bible, here we have the daughters of Zelophehad. So this is after the new census, the second census. In Numbers 26, there's a new generation that's come about, right? The old generation, almost all of it, has passed away. The new generation is ready to go into the land. But there's a problem. Right after they talk about these different families and the peoples, the clans in them, and about the land that they are all being given, because there's a principle here that everyone in ancient Israel gets the same amount of land, and that if you happen to waste your land or throw it away somehow or get rid of it, that the next generation is going to get it back in some way, that Jubilee law, right, that we saw in Leviticus chapter 25. Okay, so based on this, the idea is that everyone in ancient Israel has access to land, which is productive, right? The land isn't like a front yard that you just put some flowers in or something, or grass. It's productive, it's agricultural land. That's the only way to make a living, to actually survive in the ancient world. Not the only way. You could be a merchant maybe, but there's just very few options for people who don't have land. It's not like anyone could start a business or become a merchant. There's lots of things you had to know. It was a difficult, strange occupation for people. You couldn't just go to the city and find a job. These things didn't exist in the ancient world. If you didn't have land, you were basically dead. So the daughters of Zelophehad are named here in this text as having a dispute with the law and with Moses and with God about the land. So the daughters of Zelophehad, chapter 27, verse 1. The daughters of Zelophehad came forward. Zelophehad was the son of Hefer, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, a member of the Manassite clans. They're trying to give you the genealogy because he fits, right? He deserves land, right? He's part of the community of ancient Israel. He's got this ancestor that he's owed land. The names of his daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. So he's got 5 daughters here. So Mala, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah stand before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting. These bold, brave women who get up and before God and the leaders and all of the people, and they say, the law's wrong. God got it wrong. Moses, you have gotten it wrong. So they say, verse 3, our father died in the wilderness, that is Zelophehad. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah. Remember Numbers 16 we talked about? So he wasn't one of the rebellious guys. What they're trying to say is our dad was a good guy. Like he wasn't kicked out of the community for any reason. He deserved land in other ways. He died for his own sin. He had no sons. So the one problem we see here so far is that he has no sons. Now, why should this be a problem? Who cares? Well, in ancient Israel, the land, according to the law, was passed down through the males in the family. That is, fathers gave the land to sons, and women were expected to marry with men who had access to land through their father's line in some way. We call this a patriarchal society, which comes with all sorts of ethical problems too, because even if you just have these kind of rules and you say, well, they don't mean anything, it's just a way to divide it up, right? It's going to end up having these ethical and value-based differences that it creates, right? So men are worth more in this ancient culture because they have access to land and women don't. So this is to say that this should be a thing that troubles us, right? These women are being left out of this landed world in ancient Israel. On top of that, when women marry men, they tended to bring with them something called a bride price. They brought with them some kind of some wealth of some sort into the family that came from the family from which they were leaving. So their father was responsible in some way for giving them something to bring into the new family. Well, they have no land now because Zelophehad had died, and he had no sons. So his land went to like some distant relative, the next closest male relative. So they don't have any land. They don't have any money. They don't have a dad who's looking out for them in this patriarchal culture, trying to in some way create marriage alliances or relationships. They're left out in the cold, and they have no bride price. They have no money to bring with them into any relationship. So they basically have no options. In an agricultural society, this means they're destitute. So they haven't even gotten to the land yet, and they've already been written out of the story. The important thing here is that they say, verse 4, why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? He's got daughters. His name, meaning both his name, but also his actual land, right? His name right. You'll see the word inheritance used sometimes. That's the Hebrew word nachalah, which means not just like inheriting, like, grandma's silver or, whatever, grandpa's watch. No, it means inheriting land. That was a right that God had given to all people. Everyone inherits land of some kind. But they said, just because there's no son, we don't have a brother, we're going to lose all of our land, all of our access to land. And then they say, give to us. This is an imperative verb. They're commanding God and Moses. They say, give us a possession among our father's brothers. Give it to us. All right. We're being written out of the story. But that's wrong. I know it's what the law says, but the law is wrong. What they're appealing to is that there is some sort of principle of right and wrong that's higher than the law. Important thing to note here is that what they're saying here is that the law is culturally conditioned. If God is going to speak into the world in some sort of way that responds to human ethics and that's interpretable by human communities, then it's going to have to involve human stuff, which means it's going to have to be in some way already broken. So God is speaking into a patriarchal culture. The land regulations are going to respect that and respond to it in some way. But that doesn't mean God's done. God's still working. God's going to be in some way working through this narrative and through the daughters of Zelophehad, who are like the agent of God in this story, to reform and redress the problems that exist in the culture through which God is trying to work and within which God is trying to work. So these women bring their issue, their problem. We're being left out. And the response is not by Moses or God. It is not, we can't change the law is the law, God is always right, etc. No, the response is, the law is incorrect. It's wrong because it leaves you out, so we're going to update it and change it. So verse 5, Moses brought their case before the Lord. Notice it's like a legal case. They're suing God and Moses and all the Israelites because it's like a breach of contract of the covenant. The covenant is based on the idea that everyone's got access to land and that no one's going to be left out. It's breaking the covenant is breaking its own covenant, right? So this is a lawsuit here. By the way, we'll talk more about covenants and contracts and so on when we talk about the legal core of Deuteronomy in next week. So then Moses brought the case before God, and then verse 6, the Lord spoke to Moses and said, now notice how God speaks here. The daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they're saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers and pass the inheritance of their father on to them. Now, what kind of language follows? What kind of literature are we listening to right now? You shall also say to the Israelites, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give an inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. It shall be for the Israelites a statute and ordinance as the Lord commanded Moses. What kind of language is that? That's new law. We just made new law. They're not even to the land yet. They've just left Sinai, and we're getting new law. So just like the Passover law, right? God is responsive to change the law in response to human voices, which bring up particular cases and instances where they are left out of God's community, left out of the blessing of God's community, of the wealth of God's community, who, if they're not welcomed into parties and the communion of God's community, then there has to be an allowance made. God has to fix this, right? So we can see this in several different places too. I mean, throughout the Bible, it's not just in Numbers. I mean, take a look at really quick Deuteronomy chapter 23. Chapter 23, verse 1. This is something that I've already mentioned when we talked about priests, is that priests had to be whole. So I couldn't be a priest in the ancient world because my eyes are defective, right? According to ancient Israelite ways of thinking about the human body and expectations and so on. Today, no one would look at my eyes and say, my glasses and say, well, you obviously are disabled. We have different categories of abilities and disabilities than ancient Israelites did. And by the way, we might want to think about those categories and the ways that we treat disabilities and abilities and so on. But all to say, this chapter 23 of Deuteronomy names what was considered a physical disability in the ancient world. They start by saying, no one whose testicles are crushed or whose penis is cut off shall be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. And then also those born of an illicit union shall not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. So what would be considered, to use a word that's, this is the right word for the situation, like a bastard child or something, right? Not in the mean sense, or I guess it is mean, but not in the sense where I'm trying to insult somebody, but it's the name for a child born out of wedlock. So these are things that are considered impure. These people are not supposed to kind of come into God's presence, right? They're not supposed to be admitted into the assembly of the Lord. For that first category, those people whose testicles are crushed, his penis cuff, this is assuming a man's body, a male body, but at the same time, this would the word that's used for folks who, for some reason, and there are different reasons, would not fit within the typical gender categories of the ancient world, those being male and female, or man and woman. We've got kind of sex and gender there, which are slightly different categories, but all to say that anyone who didn't fit in these somewhat a little bit amorphous categories at certain times, but anyone who didn't fit in these two categories was considered a eunuch. We've heard Jesus talk about this term and say that there's different ways that people can kind of be classified in this third category. So Jesus says some people were born eunuchs, some people made themselves eunuchs, some people became eunuchs, right? And this is not understood to be something where somebody has been separated from God's presence for some reason by the time of Jesus. But here in Deuteronomy, this is anyone whose body doesn't fit into the typical categories that people would expect in the ancient world, anyone whose probably expression of their gender didn't fit into the typical categories that people had, was considered a eunuch. So this was, like I said, a broad category in the ancient world, a category that did give expression to the idea that there is Like there are people who don't fit into the two gender categories. It didn't consist of really a third gender in the way that some. But in any event, it's this kind of amorphous category, a catch-all category. But it's also in Deuteronomy said to be unclean. You can't come into the assembly. You have to leave. Right? Well, it's law. This is in the Bible. Right? It's in Deuteronomy. It's in the law of Moses. You can't question that, right? You can't question God from Sinai, and you can't question the words from Moses' mouth. It's the law, right? And the law is the law, except when it's not, right? That is to say, this gets challenged, and there's one voice in particular who takes this head on, and that is the voice of Isaiah. So if we turn with me real quickly to Isaiah chapter 56. So Isaiah chapter 56 is addressing this exact situation. Why are eunuchs, anyone who's put into this third category of gender, why are they excluded from the temple? But also foreigners. Why are these foreigners excluded from the temple? If you look back at Deuteronomy 23, verse 3 and on, are about how Ammonites and Moabites, these foreign people, they aren't allowed into the category. They aren't allowed into the assembly. They aren't allowed to come close to God, especially the Ammonites and the Moabites, because they did bad things to us. Like in Numbers 25, there was that whole Baal that they got people to worship, Baal Peor, right? This kind of revulsion. There's a revulsion towards these people who made us worship foreign gods and so on. Now we might say, did the people make you worship foreign gods, or did you want to do that, right? But also this idea that women are in some way this kind of gateway drug. Foreigners, and especially foreign women, are some gateway drug to foreign worship. Is, I think, that's a defense mechanism. It's a strategy to say it's not my fault, right? All to say that in chapter 56 of Isaiah, Isaiah takes Deuteronomy 23 head on and says it's not right. It's not just that it's not right because I don't like it. It's not right because this deep principle of inclusion in the community of God to all people that we see modeled in the daughters of Zelophehad, we have to respond to those voices of people who have been left out and who are saying, give us an inheritance, give us a life, give us inclusion in the community. So chapter 56 of Isaiah, thus says the Lord, maintain justice, do what's right, for soon my salvation will come and my deliverance will be revealed. Happy is the mortal who does this. And then verse 3, do not let the foreigner joined to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. That is, if a foreigner, if anyone of the foreign nations, an Ammonite, a Moabite, if they love God, then who are you to put them away? To send them away, to tell them they aren't one of us, they can't come into our community. That's actually going against the basic idea of this community that God formed out of this mixed multitude in Exodus 12. Exodus 12 says it's a mixed multitude of people who came out of Egypt. Yeah, sure, some people who are kind of descendants of Abraham and Sarah, but also bunches of other people too who wanted to join the community, and they're welcome. So, and do not let the eunuch say, Isaiah says in verse 3, do not let the eunuch say, I'm just a dry tree. Don't let the eunuch say about themselves, this person who's been put into this category, I'm basically walking dead. I have no use. I'm not fruitful. I can't have kids, so I'm not worth anything. I mean, I don't have a pure body, so I can't go into the temple, right? Other people make fun of me, so I might as well go away. Don't let them say that. Verse 4, for thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths and who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant. That is, if you're for God, if you love God, if you serve God, if you want to be with God, then God is going to give, verse 5, in my house and within my walls, a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name, and they shall not be cut off. So this idea that God is going to let them come in and indeed bring them into the house. Remember, they're being excluded from the house of God in Deuteronomy 23. They're not allowed in. Here, in Isaiah 56, don't you dare cut these people off from me. Instead, you're going to bring them in to my house, and there they will have a monument, and their name is going to be written up there on the wall, and it's going to be bigger and better than anyone who's got kids, right? Who fits, right? Who's looks like the kind of person you would expect according to the traditions of the day, according to the cultural ideas of the day. Well, that's a good family, right? The folks who are considered eunuchs and are instead brought into the house of God, they are going to be the ones who are exalted. This probably sounds a little bit like Jesus to you, right? Jesus loved this part of the book of Isaiah. In fact, Isaiah 56, Jesus quotes Isaiah 61, which is part of this same tradition, this part of the book of Isaiah, these kind of speeches that have to do with what's considered outsiders, the year of the Lord's favor, right? Jesus is so moved by this part of the book of Isaiah and by these this is part of Jesus' message of inclusion. The New Testament is about this. So now maybe you understand why Jesus says, you've heard it said in Moses' law, but now I say to you. Jesus wasn't doing something new or different. Jesus was, in fact, following the same traditions that we see so importantly depicted in the book of Numbers in particular. We can also say that at the end of the book of Numbers, the daughters of Zelophehad come back, Numbers 36, because there's that issue of every family getting the same amount of land so that certain families couldn't become more powerful in the community. Of course, this ends up happening over time because Israel abandons the law. Right? We know this, but like abandoning the law means that you're not actually trying to make sure that every single person in your community is upheld, has the same access to land and the ability to live, that they don't have these same kind of basically a social safety net for them to exist in. When foreigners, when wandering aliens are ignored, Israel's walking away from the law. This is what's called idolatry. It's called going after foreign gods, is abandoning these core principles of ancient Israelite law. That is, everyone in the community has access to life and inclusion in the community. So all to say, you can see the law has stuff in it that goes against these principles, which I think is true of every human law. No human law. And by the way, Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, the law that God gives to Moses at Sinai is spoken in human language. It's given to a particular human culture. You can think of this as God meeting people in a particular place in a way that they understand. And God accepts that this is if they're going to understand me, God probably is thinking, then it's going to have to involve some of their problems, right? God accepts that humans have shortcomings when it comes to language, when it comes to culture, when it comes to law. God works with the people. Remember in the book of Genesis, God accepts at the end of the Noah story in Genesis 9, God accepts, okay, human hearts are broken, but I'm going to work with them anyway. This is part of what it means to work with broken human hearts, is that God's going to accept some of this terrible stuff, but God is going to relentlessly try to change it over time in a way that we can understand and work with. So Numbers 36 is this resumption of the daughters of Zelophehad, where they come back because they've been ignored for too long. So this is a kind of resumption of this very problem. So there's a conflict between the clans, which then say if these women can marry anybody they want, but then we're going to have a kind of a disproportionate clans. That is, some families can make out if all 5 of these daughters marry into a different clan, then that other clan can become a super clan and get all this extra land, right? This could be a big problem. So God says, okay, let's talk about this again. And then they have another round of conversations where they try to uphold these values of the community that are somewhat in tension, and they come to a resolution that seems to be good for everyone. So all to say is that this was a process that God goes through. The 10 Commandments themselves reflect changes. We'll get to that more when we talk about the 10 Commandments themselves, but the 10 Commandments change. And that change seems to reflect a change in the community from being a wandering community in Exodus to being a landed community, or at least on the verge of being a landed community in the book of Deuteronomy. So all of this I get from looking at how law or instruction and narrative are interspersed with each other and are responding to each other throughout the book of Numbers. Does this make sense? This is one way of organizing all this material that is jumbled up in the book of Numbers. And I think it teaches us something. Now, we've got 2 different ways. Now, forget all that, because we're going to move to a second video where I'm going to give you a totally different read of this book just by organizing it differently. I'm going to prove to you that this book doesn't mean what I just said it means. It's going to mean something different. I'll see you in the next video.